The grand Willowbrook mansion stood tall in the heart of Boston, its towering spires and ivy-covered walls once a symbol of opulence and power. It had been in the Williams family for generations, a dynasty built on steel, railroads, and industry. But despite its grandeur, there was an air of darkness that clung to the estate like a shadow, one that no amount of wealth could dispel. Peter Williams had inherited the mansion from his father, just as his father had before him. He was a man who commanded respect wherever he went, his reputation as a savvy businessman making him one of the most powerful figures in New England. But behind the veneer of success, Peter's life was unraveling. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when Peter had everything a man could want: money, power, and a beautiful family. His wife, Evelyn, was the epitome of grace and elegance, while their son, Michael, was the apple of Peter's eye. Life had been good to Peter, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, dark secrets festered, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It all began one Halloween night, a year to the day before Peter was committed to the Willowbrook Asylum. Halloween at Willowbrook Mansion was always a grand affair. Each year, the Williams family hosted a lavish party, inviting the creme de la creme of Boston society to celebrate the spookiest night of the year. The mansion would be decorated with cobwebs, candles flickering in the windows, and pumpkins lining the long driveway that led up to the imposing front entrance. The night was crisp, with the chill of autumn in the air, and inside the mansion, laughter and music filled every corner. Guests in elaborate costumes mingled in the grand ballroom, sipping champagne and exchanging stories of ghosts and ghouls. But this year's celebration felt different. Peter, normally the life of the party, seemed distant. He spent most of the evening standing by the large bay window in the library, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape outside. His mind was somewhere else, far away from the revelry taking place around him. Evelyn noticed her husband's unusual behavior and approached him quietly. "Peter, are you all right?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He turned to her, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking about business, my dear. You know how it is." Evelyn wasn't convinced, but she decided not to press him. Peter had always been a private man, and over the years, she had learned to give him space when he needed it. As the night wore on, the partygoers continued to enjoy themselves, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of Willowbrook Mansion. It was well past midnight when the party began to wind down. Most of the guests had left, and the staff were busy cleaning up the remnants of the celebration. Peter and Evelyn retreated to their bedroom, exhausted from the long evening. Peter lay in bed, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There had been a moment earlier in the night, just before midnight, when he thought he saw someone standing on the roof of the mansion. He had been looking out the window, lost in thought, when a flash of movement caught his eye. It was brief, just a shadow, but it was enough to send a shiver down his spine. "Probably just a trick of the light," he muttered to himself, but the unease lingered. At around 3 a.m., Peter was jolted awake by a loud noise. It was the grandfather clock in the hallway, its chimes echoing through the silent house. But something was off. The clock had struck 13 times. Peter sat up in bed, his heart pounding. He glanced over at Evelyn, who was still sound asleep beside him. Carefully, he slid out of bed and grabbed his robe. He needed to check on Michael. He moved silently down the hall, his footsteps barely making a sound on the plush carpet. When he reached Michael's room, he opened the door and peeked inside. His son was fast asleep, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Relieved, Peter closed the door and made his way towards the stairs. Something compelled him to go up to the roof. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the strange shadow he had seen earlier, or the unsettling chimes of the clock. But he felt drawn to the rooftop, as if an invisible force was pulling him there. As he climbed the stairs to the roof, a cold breeze hit him, sending a chill down his spine. When he reached the top, he stepped out onto the roof, his eyes scanning the dark expanse around him. At first, everything seemed normal. The night was quiet, the stars twinkling in the sky above. But then, he saw her. Sitting on the ledge of the roof was a woman in a long white gown, her back to him. Her legs dangled over the edge, and she appeared to be talking to someone, though there was no one there. Peter's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he called out, his voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She continued talking, her voice too low for him to make out the words. Peter took a step closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Who are you?" he repeated, louder this time. Slowly, the woman turned her head to look at him. Her eyes were glowing red, and her face was twisted into a grotesque smile. Peter stumbled backward, fear gripping him. Without warning, the woman let out a blood-curdling scream and threw herself off the roof. Peter rushed to the edge, his heart racing, but when he looked down, there was nothing there. No body, no blood, just the empty garden below. He stood there, frozen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just seen. It had to be a nightmare, but it felt so real. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. Peter spun around, his eyes wide with terror, but there was no one there. He ran back to the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest, and descended as quickly as he could. When he reached the safety of his bedroom, he collapsed onto the bed, his body trembling. Evelyn stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open. "Peter, what's wrong?" she asked groggily. Peter couldn't bring himself to tell her. How could he explain what he had just seen? "Nothing," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Just a bad dream." In the days that followed, Peter tried to convince himself that the woman on the roof had been a figment of his imagination, but the image of her glowing red eyes and twisted smile haunted him. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. Strange things began to happen around the mansion. At night, Peter would hear footsteps in the hallways, but when he went to investigate, no one was there. The grandfather clock would chime at odd hours, always striking 13 times. And sometimes Peter would catch glimpses of the woman in the white gown out of the corner of his eye, only for her to disappear when he looked directly at her. His behavior grew erratic. He became withdrawn, spending long hours locked in his study, poring over old family records, searching for some clue that might explain what was happening. He became obsessed with the history of Willowbrook Mansion, convinced that the key to his torment lay in the past. Evelyn grew increasingly concerned for her husband. She tried to talk to him, to understand what was troubling him, but Peter refused to open up. He insisted that everything was fine, though she could see the fear in his eyes. One evening, after a particularly long day, Evelyn found Peter sitting in the library, staring at a painting that hung on the wall. It was an old portrait of Emily Hawthorne, the daughter of the mansion's former caretaker. Emily had died under mysterious circumstances many years ago, though the details had been lost to time. "Peter, why are you staring at that painting?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft. Peter didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the portrait, his face pale and gaunt. "Peter?" Evelyn pressed, stepping closer. Finally, Peter spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's the one," he said. "The woman on the roof. It's her." Evelyn frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Peter turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. "Emily Hawthorne. She's haunting me." Evelyn's heart sank. She had always suspected that Peter's mind was unraveling, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. "Peter, Emily has been dead for over 100 years. She can't hurt you." But Peter shook his head, his expression frantic. "You don't understand. She's here. I've seen her. She wants revenge." Evelyn didn't know what to say. She had never believed in ghosts, but the terror in Peter's eyes was undeniable. "Maybe you should see someone, Peter," she said gently. "A doctor, perhaps. They might be able to help you." But Peter recoiled at the suggestion. "I'm not crazy, Evelyn. I know what I saw." Evelyn sighed, realizing that there was no convincing him. She could only hope that whatever was happening to him would pass in time. As the weeks went on, Peter's condition worsened. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were filled with visions of Emily. She would visit him in the dead of night, standing at the foot of his bed, her red eyes glowing in the darkness. She never spoke, but her presence was enough to drive Peter to the brink of madness. It wasn't long before Michael noticed his father's erratic behavior. He had always looked up to Peter, admired him for his strength and determination, but now he hardly recognized the man his father had become. One evening, after a particularly intense episode, Michael confronted Peter in his study. "Dad, what's going on? You're scaring us." Peter looked up from the pile of old records on his desk, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "It's Emily," he muttered. "She's haunting me." Michael frowned. "Emily? Who's Emily?" Peter gestured to the portrait on the wall. "Emily Hawthorne. She died because of me." Michael's confusion deepened. "What are you talking about?" Peter leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling. "Years ago, before you were born, I met Emily. We were involved, but I couldn't let anyone know. She was the caretaker's daughter, and I was set to inherit everything. If anyone found out about us, it would have ruined me." Michael listened in stunned silence as his father recounted the affair. "I thought I could keep it a secret, but Emily, she wanted more. She wanted us to be together, publicly, but I couldn't let that happen. One night, I went to her room and I gave her something." Peter's voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. "I gave her poison. She died in her sleep, and everyone thought it was an accident. I made sure of it." Michael's stomach churned with disgust. He had always looked up to his father, but now he saw him for what he truly was, a murderer. "Now she's back," Peter continued, his voice shaking. "She wants revenge. She wants to take you from me, just like I took her life." Michael couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had always known that his family's wealth was built on lies and deceit. But this was something far worse. "You're insane," Michael spat, his voice filled with anger. Peter didn't argue. He knew it was true. He had been insane for a long time. The night of reckoning came on Halloween, exactly 1 year after Peter first saw Emily on the roof. By this point, he had been committed to the asylum, but that didn't stop Emily from haunting him. On the eve of Halloween, Peter escaped from the asylum. How he managed to slip past the guards, no one could say, but by morning, he was gone. Michael and Evelyn were frantic. They searched the mansion from top to bottom, but there was no sign of Peter. It wasn't until nightfall that Michael found him, standing on the roof, just like he had been a year ago. "Dad!" Michael called, his voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Peter turned to him, his face pale and gaunt. "It's time," he whispered. "She's come for me." Michael stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Dad, there's no one here. It's just you and me." But Peter shook his head. "No, she's here. She's always been here." Suddenly, the air around them grew cold, and Michael felt a presence beside him. He turned, and there, standing just a few feet away, was Emily. Her eyes glowed red, and her twisted smile sent a chill down Michael's spine. She was real. Before Michael could react, Peter stepped forward. "Take me," he whispered. "I deserve this, but leave my son out of it." Emily's smile widened, and without a word, she reached out and touched Peter's arm. In an instant, his body went limp, and he collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Michael stood there, frozen in place, as Emily slowly faded from view. The night was silent once more. Peter Williams was buried in the family plot behind Willowbrook Mansion. His death officially ruled a suicide, but Michael knew the truth. He sold the mansion not long after, unable to live with the memories of what had happened. But even after he left, the nightmares followed him. Every Halloween, without fail, Michael would wake in the middle of the night to the sound of the grandfather clock chiming 13 times. And somewhere in the distance, he could still hear Emily's twisted laughter, echoing through the dark.